Good morning and welcome to this webinar organised by Resilience First in partnership with the London Climate Change Partnership. By way of introduction, Resilience First's mission is to help business resilience in business communities whether those communities be defined by geography or special interest. Those of you who viewed the opening video, I hope you gained a brief insight on our organisation. Now, Resilience First has long been a member of LCCP. In return, I'm pleased to say that that organisation has been one of our many associates. We share a common interest in an understanding of and promoting the practical responses to climate change. How businesses of all sizes can be both affected and influential in that topic. We accept that we all need to change and adapt in this slow burn issue, which has been compared to that story of the boiling frog. As The Economist reported this week, companies everywhere urgently need to step up their action against climate change. So we hope we are doing our bit this morning. Hence, we put together, that's LCCP and Resilience First, have organised today's webinar to shed some light on certain aspects of the climate emergency, with contributions from real experts in the field. This week is Climate Week. It's the right moment to be talking about the subject. Focus today is on business adaptation. One aspect of that is how the insurance sector can provide incentives while also being perhaps a detractor to meeting the risk. Regrettably, insurance take-up for flooding and heat-related damage remains relatively low. We've asked our assembled speakers to offer us their assessments from their respective leadership positions on the way the systemic risk of climate change is evolving and the role that the insurance market can play in driving behavioural change and encouraging citizens, corporations and communities alike to be more resilient to the inevitable changes from a warming planet. Out of these discussions and other activities, we hope to produce a working paper that will generate a work stream on the role of insurance in climate adaptation and mitigation ahead of COP26 next year. Now, to help us make sense of the topic today, we're fortunate to have secured the time of not only 4 excellent speakers, but also our expert chair for the webinar, Professor Chris Rapley from University College London, who was the former chairman of LCCP. You will find details of Chris's biography and all the other speakers in your joining instructions. Before handing the proceedings over to the chair, I'll invite you to ask questions of the speakers throughout the session by posting your short written questions in the chat box to the right of the screen. I'm sure the chair will pick up as many as he can as we go into the Q&A session. So with no further ado from me, I'll hand the virtual floor over to Chris.
Thanks very much indeed, Robert, and it's a pleasure to be here. I've been involved in the scientific study of the climate system since the early 1980s. And in those days, we knew that burning fossil fuels and land use change had upset the energy balance of the planet, and that there would follow inevitable cascade of climatic consequences, largely with negative consequences on human affairs. It took 15 years of work by huge numbers of researchers developing observing systems and computer models to reach to the point where the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change could say that the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate. It took another 10 years to reach the point where they could announce that the warming of the climate system is unequivocal. Now, a further decade on, we're seeing the impacts of climate change as a harsh reality all around us. Wildfires in California, storms and floods in the US, heat waves, permafrost melting, fires in Siberia, massive reduction of the sea ice cover in the Arctic Ocean, floods in Africa, with huge and growing consequences and damages. And despite a growing body of actions by many businesses, a commendable and growing set of actions to manage their risks, there's much evidence that the general state of preparedness is poor. So I congratulate Resilience First and the London Climate Change Partnership on organising this event, which is highly pertinent. Now, I'm going to assume that all the participants have seen the agenda, We have 4 short presentations from our invited speaker panelists, each addressing a specific question. And then we'll have 25 minutes of Q&A, responding to questions that you can enter into the chat box. After the Q&A, I'll briefly summarize, and then Robert will close the proceedings at 10:30 sharp. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the first of our invited speakers, Professor Jason Lowe, Head of Climate Knowledge Integration and Mitigation Advice at the Met Office. And I'll ask Jason to speak for 5 minutes on the question, what is the latest science telling us about the risk from climate hazards, and what resources are available to help support businesses in taking adaptive responses, including access to experts? So over to you, Jason.
Thank you very much, Chris. So I'm going to make 3 key points. 1, what we've seen so far. 2, what we might expect from the future. And the 3rd, what tools are available to help people plan on a place-based manner. May we have the next slide, please? Okay, let me see if I can change it myself. Here we go.
Yeah.
So to start with, if we look at the observed record, we can see the climate system changing. We can look globally, and we see the global average temperature now more than a degree above pre-industrial levels. We've seen sea level rise by more than 20 centimeters since 1900. And we've also seen reductions in sea ice extent. Those changes are associated with a number of global impacts. If we look at the UK, we've seen changes in mean climate, but also climate extremes. For instance, if we look at the length of warm periods, that has extended from around 5 days in a period 1960 to 1990, up to around 13 days in the most recent decade. We've also seen changes in extreme rainfall. So if we look at the most intense rainfall events, we see an increase of around 17% in the amount of rainfall associated with those events. And those extremes in particular come with a range of impacts. It might be impacts on people's health through high temperatures. It might be impacts through flooding, for instance, on infrastructure or people's homes. It might also be through increasing periods of drought. And we're experiencing those today. It's not something that's far off in the future. We're already seeing those. When we look at the future, we have tools that are based on well understood physics. So we can use our computer models to give an impression of how the future will alter. The amount of future climate change will depend on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions we put into the atmosphere. So there's a wide spread in potential outcomes. Now, the slide on the left is showing an estimate when we look across 4 alternative views of the future, going from the lowest, where there are rapid reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions, through one that takes account of current policies, up to a future where greenhouse gas emissions actually continue to increase. And you can see from the plot on the left, which shows global average temperature, that the 1.5 degree world is still in reach. It's still possible, but that's really the minimum level that we think is possible at the moment. So even with the strongest mitigation, we will need to build resilience. We will need adaptation. Current policies and a central estimate of our understanding of the science takes us to around 3 degrees of global warming. And it could be, with the highest scenarios, that global average temperatures rise by around 6 degrees. And as the temperature goes up, the impacts associated with that also increase. The right-hand plot is taking this idea that we don't live in the global average. And also, we don't experience annual average temperatures. So we've zoomed in on a region around Leeds in this example, and we look at the probability in any given year of getting a summer like that of 2018. And we can see that has increased from around 5% in 1990 through around 25 to 30% in the present day, and may reach of the order of 50% or more by the middle of the century. So the potential for climate change is considerable, but what can we do in terms of informing the size of that? We have a range of tools from climate science. For present day resilience and risk, we have better observational data sets with more spatial detail and synthetic observations to look at climate extremes far into the tail. We have more skill in seasonal forecasts, so we can give an impression of what might happen 3 or 4 months ahead. And when we look on very long timescales, we can use projections like UKCP to again try to understand the risk which we may have to adapt to. Finally, one of the big developments in climate science is bringing together the hazard information with information on exposure and vulnerability from organizations such as yours. Chris, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Jason, and thank you very much for keeping to time. So let's press on. You have plenty of opportunity to ask Jason questions in the Q&A session. So our next speaker is Professor Dame Julia King, Baroness Brown of Cambridge, and Chair of the Adaptation Subcommittee of the UK Climate Change Committee. And Julia will address the question, what does the emerging evidence of the third climate change risk assessment tell us about the greatest challenges for business from climate change? Over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much. Well, as Jason has very well explained the type of risks that there are, so that's a very, very helpful place for me to continue from. And of course, the range of challenges for business will vary very considerably depending on the nature of the business, of course. Jason has given us a good view of how the risks can be local and physical, risks to your business from flood damage, from wildfire, from heat and high temperatures, perhaps. And he's also shown how all of these will be becoming more common, but they will also be, of course, becoming more expensive as we move into the future. So, for example, in the UK by 2050, in a low adaptation scenario, i.e. where we don't take many more measures than we have today, even the flood damages could almost double. And even if we're on that 1.5 degree path that is still within reach, thank goodness, and we've got high adaptation measures, and Emma has had a lot more money for the Environment Agency, we will still see some increase in damages in our predictions. Of course, how we adapt will also depend on the business. It may be that new flood defences will be essential, but it could be for some businesses as simple as moving your stock off the floor to a higher level. But it's not just the direct risks to the business, of course. Risks can affect your supply chain, and whether that supply chain is in the UK or overseas. So, for example, if you're a food company with tea, coffee, cotton, or roses, flood, drought, extreme weather, heat, and new pests and diseases overseas will be really important to you. And Associated British Foods, Rosalind Schofield, who is their sustainability director, is on our adaptation committee. They've had the Met Office work with them to look at the global implications of climate change for their supply chains. So, for example, in a world where we're on track for 2 degrees of warming, by the mid-century, parts of the Indian subcontinent, Sahel, and North Australia are likely to see 10 to 30 days per annum where heat stress thresholds are exceeded, meaning that even acclimatized locals can't work outside because it's too dangerous. So tea, cotton, and other suppliers in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India could be badly affected and need to be preparing and adapting. Companies, of course, may want to support this, particularly if their suppliers are in developing countries. It may be critical to diversify supply chains to different regions. And of course, it's a good reason why we shouldn't try and grow all of our food in the UK. Self-sufficiency itself is a risk. Thirdly, there will be risks to productivity from overheating, and that's become especially evident now we're working from home. We've seen temperatures of over 47 degrees measured in some London flats in the summer of 2018. And MHCLG's own research shows that all new homes overheat in a normal summer. Exceptional summers, as Jason showed on his chart, exceptional summers like 2018 will be perfectly normal in Leeds in 2050. So how will your staff cope in those conditions? There are, of course, lots of risks of the people you are dependent on, risks of interdependencies. So what about the road and rail system? Much of that will be at increased risk from flooding, and we've seen problems with overheated overhead cables on the West Coast Main Line in recent years, stopping the trains between London and Birmingham. So how will your staff get to work? Will your deliveries arrive? Are your just-in-time stock levels still appropriate? Will the broadband or the telephone network system still function? It failed in Durham in 2016. Will you have electricity? These are all questions of how the people you are dependent on are preparing. Then next, there is, of course, transition risk. Are your products still going to be saleable in a low-carbon world? The most obvious example being, do you make internal combustion engine parts? Because by 2030 to 2035, all new cars and vans will have to be fully low carbon. Indeed, are consumers changing their behavior such that they're going to be concerned about your carbon footprint? And actually, is there going to be a major change in consumer demand? Are people going to buy different clothes because we're working for home perhaps, or because it's much warmer in the summer? Or are people going to want a lot more barbecue products? What if your product is water? Will people be using much more or much less of it? And then there's the reputational risk. Have staff in your supply chain died from picking cotton in extreme temperatures because you put pressure on your suppliers? These are, of course, issues that are of significant interest now to lenders, to insurers, to investors, to pension funds, I hope to all of us as consumers. And I'd just like to end by saying, on the adaptation committee, we'd like to see a bit of change in language, really, about what is a risk. What do we call a risk? 2 degrees of warming, as Jason has shown us, is not a risk, but pretty much a certainty. That is something you should plan for, not put on your risk register. 4 degrees is sadly still quite possible, and that certainly needs to be on your risk register. But as Jason has also pointed out, 2 degrees is actually a distribution of outcomes, and you also need to take this into account. By 2050, summer temperatures in southeast England are likely to be 3 to 4 degrees warmer, but there's a 10% chance they could be 6 degrees hotter. So our view on the adaptation committee is that good planning is about planning for 2 degrees and making sure 4 degrees and the extremes of the distribution are on your risk register. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Julia. That's terrific. Now, it looks like we're having some technical problems with Emma's link. So we're going to jump straight on at this point to Philip Songhurst-Tonnet, who is the director in the company Control Risks. And Philip, will you address the question, please? How can we deploy insurance to effectively drive business adaptation? Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll be very happy to do that. And I mean, the very short answer is, in one sentence, is absolutely insurance and insurers can support more so the embedding of how organisations can, in a longer term, manage their risks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer the question in three steps. First, by building a little more context on the excellent context that my colleagues on the call have already provided, then talking a little about the insurance sector's challenges related to that context. And then really bring on to 4 or 5 things which I think we can all be doing, not only the insurance sector, but the organisations we all work for, in helping to identify the climate risks across our assets and organisations, and making sure that our CEOs and C-suites are on board with supporting a very clear agenda around how we deal with those risks long term. But just stepping back, I was lucky enough to work around 10, 15 years ago in 2007 in Canada for the oil and gas sector. And at that point, we were looking at focusing on sustainability and quantifying the impacts of climate change on organisations like oil and gas companies using readily available data. Now, even at that point, you could do quite a lot of that, understanding the risks, the likelihood, but data was always the challenge, and especially in certain key metrics, the price to quantify sustainability was always an issue. Now if you fast forward, to 2020, we're awash with data, and theoretically, we should be able to use that data to predict, climate change, the impacts, and quantify that risk much more than we could have done so in the past, giving us greater certainty about what those impacts would be. But the challenge is still very much there. And if you look at the numbers, which never really lie, the number of natural disasters causing over $1 billion worth of damage has been on a steady rise for more than a decade. Insurance payouts for natural catastrophe events in 2017 and 2018 stood at over $219 billion, the highest ever consecutive 2-year period. So the numbers are supporting the variability in climate change, the volatility, and also the impact. And insurers are starting to recognise that is only set to continue over the next decade. And they regularly, organisations are putting climate change and climate risk much more up the list of top risks which they're focusing on in their sectors. But even with all that data, it's still a huge challenge, as I'm sure our Met Office colleagues will know, to forecast with any certainty the variability of climate over the longer term. And the insurance sector as a whole needs facts and figures to be able to underwrite policies and premiums to make sure that they can still, ultimately be a solvent business themselves and be a solvent sector of our, an important solvent sector of our industry. And so I'll talk about that a little bit around how we can talk about some of the solutions. That data point is key, and the insurance sector therefore can't do everything by themselves. They need to have support from government and other stakeholders and organisations across industry to be able to drive change effectively and to make change stick longer term. But on to some of the things that I think the insurance sector can help with for sure. First and foremost, it's looking at driving that climate agenda, making sure that organisations, very much from the top downwards, think about climate risk, raise the profile of climate risk in their organisations, C-suite is aligned to those. The second important component is getting an improved assessment of climate risk and using advanced analytics to do that within the insurance sector. And I know a number of insurers and brokers have got that capacity already. Then it's making sure that we have the right insurance products to actually support organisations the right way. And more importantly, when something does go wrong, whether it's a physical risk or reputational damage due to climate change, that those insurance policies can and will pay out, and those triggers that trigger those policies are the right ones. Two more points, if I may, then I'll finish off. And that is the importance of making sure that all organisations understand their enterprise-wide view of managing climate risks. I still think that is something which we're working on as an organisation. COSO, who is one of the leading bodies who regulates or provides frameworks for enterprise risk management, is now looking at an integrated sustainability or ESG, environmental sustainability and governance model for risk, which is something very interesting, and again, a framework to develop in the future. And then finally, around the operational side of insurance, is making sure that when insurance is provided, that corporate bodies have the right ESG guidelines in place, they have the right controls in place, and that ultimately, when insurers put policies in place, they use a stick and carrot approach. Essentially, the carrot is benefits in terms of commercial benefits. If you are using the right types of sustainability metrics, if you have, for example, using the right technology in your building designs to make sure they're environmentally friendly longer term, to use the right types of technology in fire hazard areas to make sure that buildings are less likely to burn down, to make sure that flood zones are avoided from a construction standpoint. So that's very much the carrot element. And then the stick is, well, you know, ultimately, if you don't abide by some of those rules, regulations, and metrics you're setting yourselves, then ultimately, you know, that policy or insurance premium won't be there for you to use or draw down when something goes wrong. So, in answer to the question, insurance can definitely help, but it needs wider support from government bodies and corporates across the globe to make sure that's embedded effectively. But we can ultimately have a stick and carrot approach with insurance to make sure that it is embedded and integrated. But I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much indeed, Philip. Unfortunately, Emma Howard-Boyd's connection has gone down, and it looks like we can't recover it. So Emma's chair of the Environment Agency and UK Commissioner to the Global Commission on Adaptation. So we sadly miss her presentation, but we'll move straight on. And I'm looking in the chat box, and actually, it's let's not seg away too quickly away from the last talk, because Guillem Santos asks, what are the main challenges hindering the insurance industry? Philip, you covered that a little bit, but maybe you could just say very, very briefly, from your experience, what are the big blockages? What is stopping progress? Maybe 2 or 3 things that you would pick out as the major hindrances to progress.
Yeah, certainly. So I did touch on it already. So, and I'll be really blunt. So the 3 things. The first thing is that the industry needs to still make money to be solvent. So that insurers are not going to underwrite risks which they don't fully understand, and unless we understand the data and the models behind it, it's going to be very, very difficult to do. I think that is a fundamental blocker, but having said that, I think that's slowly being put to one side with additional computing power and data and other models that are out there. I think the second part to that question is essentially building awareness in organisations are ensured that climate risk should be on the top agenda of every organisation who has significant assets globally. It needs to be on the top agenda. There needs to be a recognition that climate change is appearing to change, and that the volatility and frequency of these events are becoming much sharper and much more difficult to deal with. So those 2 key themes I think are important. And then I'm going to put a final one in there, and that is that ultimately it's that industry-wide point. I think, you know, the insurance sector can't do it by itself. There needs to be a cross-sector, cross-industry body, you know, organisation, such as the people on the call, who can help drive this forward together instead.
Thank you very much. Just on your first point about the data, I remember probably 20 years ago, I don't know if it was Swiss Re or Munich Re, and I know reinsurance is slightly different from more immediate insurance, but I remember them advising their climate team, advising their board not to reinsure large construction projects in the Low Countries, not because they knew that they were going to be flooded, but because they couldn't calculate the risk of flooding. And there was plenty of other business where they could calculate the risk. So there was a sort of planning blight because of that unavailability of information. Let's have a look now at some of the questions that are coming in. There's one from Michael Rooney on what are the key actions businesses can take to decarbonise their operations, which is really to do with how do they find the agency to both discover what their problems are and address them. Julia, from your experience on the adaptation subcommittee, do you have any insights that you could offer to help businesses start on that journey if they've not already done so?
Well, if they're trying to decarbonise their operations, it will hugely depend on what they do. But one of the first places to start is, of course, efficiency, and energy efficiency is absolutely crucial. But you know, reducing the amount of energy used, looking at if you're using gas, for example, what are your alternatives to that? Have you got opportunities to change, for example, to electric heating through a heat pump? What about your fleet? You're very likely to, many businesses will be running some kind of fleet. What are the opportunities there to move to electric cars and vans? At the moment, we don't know what the right solution is going to be for HGVs, but that will come as we go through the 2020s. I think it's also about thinking about your supply chain emissions. I think one of the things you can do is now sign up to one of these initiatives, like science-based targets, that will help you think through where CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions are occurring within your operations, and address how you can reduce those in each area. And of course, there are now a number of consultancies who will support you in doing that.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to comment? If not, there is a question from Theo Backrash saying, do companies recognize that climate risk and impact will not go away, and if action is not taken now, it will cost more to adapt later? How do you diplomatically communicate that to them? I will come back to you, Julia, on that, but why don't we ask Jason to have a go at that, because the Met Office spends a lot of its time communicating sometimes unpleasant facts to people.
Yeah, I mean, I'd start by looking back to a study that University of Cardiff produced earlier this year. So they went out and they surveyed members of the public, and of course members of the public also include people who run and own businesses. But they went out and they asked questions, I think it was last October. So it was a period when people were thinking about Brexit, but before COVID-19. And they found that certainly there was more awareness of climate change. There was also more concern. So people felt much more strongly about the issue and talked about anxiety or anger at the subject. The other thing that the study revealed was that previously awareness had been high over flooding, but not so much over other impacts. Mm-hmm. And now awareness has increased across the board. And in particular, there was a big increase in awareness around heat-related impacts. Mm-hmm. So I think that awareness is growing. And certainly part of the role of the Met Office is to make sure that we try to raise awareness, communicate clearly through infographics, through events like this. I mean, my own experience of working with many of the users of climate change through projects like UKCP is I think people are aware of the long-term climate timescales, but those timescales are just so long. I think there's some further education to do around how to implement those really into the decision-making process. So if you're going to do something that involves flexible adaptation into the future, perhaps modifying your route through the measures available to build resilience as we learn more about the climate system, then that really involves a level of awareness of how a business operates, what climate is doing, how to monitor it, and really how to factor that in to short-term decisions as well as the long-term ones.
Thanks. Yeah, and it's interesting. The point was being made earlier by Julia that this obviously we have to think locally. That's where we get the immediate impacts, but we can't escape from the consequences, both more distant in space and time. If, for example, our actions lead to the ultimate collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet, and there's some new results coming out this week that show the thresholds at which that becomes inevitable. Even if it takes thousands of years, consumers may turn against you if they see that you are one of the major causes of that as a sort of moral issue. Julia, I think you made a really important point. You know, the new normal that we're living in is a result of 1 degree of warming that we've experienced so far, just over. We're committed certainly to 1.5 and probably 2. So that's actually the normal that we need to be planning for. But you've pointed out that we should also be planning for the possibility of 4 degrees in the not too distant future. So do you want to pick up on this question as well?
Well, I think worrying about 4 degrees in the not too distant future, I think worrying, as I thought Jason's charts showed very well, worrying in the sense of having 4 degrees on your risk register, and recognizing that for the long term, we do need to be thinking about those risks, and making sure that when we're making investments now, they can either be modified to make them resistant to those higher levels of climate risk, or that, you know, we can build that in from the beginning if it isn't going to cost us too much now. And, you know, we're thinking about things like that with the current review of the Thames Barrier programme. You know, these adaptive pathways, what are the absolutely obvious things we can do now which are going to be no regrets, recognizing that, as Jason has shown us, actually there are potentially huge ranges in the increase in sea level we could be seeing by the end of the century. So do the no regret stuff now, but have a number of options that will enable you to be resilient to potentially much higher levels of climate change.
This is a point that I feel very strongly about, that the climate science community is much more comfortable predicting the best estimate of some value, sea level rise, temperature, whatever it is, and that's what it's traditionally done. It's become much better over the last few years at answering the different question, which is what is the absolute worst that might happen, even if the probability is quite low, because we need to understand what that is. That's been a shift in thinking, an important one. From the point of view of the adaptation subcommittee, which has obviously is speaking truth to power, but also has a role in speaking truth to the society more generally, how do you frame these disconcerting facts in a way that doesn't just crush people and shut them down or cause them to go into disavowal and ignore them? How do you do it in a way that engages them positively, with a kind of feeling, well, here we are where we are, you know, it's our job now to deal with this? How do you go about that?
Well, that's very challenging, and of course one of the things is that our challenge is to speak to Parliament. Actually, it's not to communicate with the general public. It's not one of the requirements in the Climate Change Act, and it's really a shame we haven't got Emma, because, you know, clearly she's there in her boots every time there's a flood, having to talk to the people who've experienced that flood, and actually thinking about how do we encourage them to recognise this isn't just a one-off. You know, if it's a 1 in 100 year flood, they think, oh, we've had that 1 in 100 year flood, so there's 100 years before the next one comes. And so she would talk very eloquently about that. But I think we have seen some good developments, and some very recent developments with Flood Re, which is the reinsurance scheme for people who live in flood risk zones, which is now that they are going to be able to fund people, or the insurance companies they work with are now going to be funding people to build back better. And until quite recently, that hasn't been the case. People have been able to reinstate their properties with the money to the standard they were at before. Now they are going to actually be able to put in the flood resilience measures that they need with the insurance. And I think that's a very simple but hugely important development.
Thank you. And in fact, that addresses one of the questions that's in the chat box, which is what can insurance do to ensure that rebuilding after a flood or another disaster is more resilient than reinstating the previous condition? Philip, do you want to add something to that thread?
No, I say thank you, and I actually agree to the point. So, I mean, you know, it's exactly that. It's building back better is one of the key schemes out there at the moment, which is you know, the right way to go. And I think you know, it comes back to regulation as well, and ensuring that where corporate organisations are talking about environmental risk and they're monitoring their environmental and sustainability risks, that those metrics they use reflect the reality of their world they're working in and the work they're doing. So you know, I think it's a really good example of what well, construction companies in this case or can be doing to do more, but ultimately more needs to be done broadly to make sure that assets are protected and that they are safe and reliable, but also as environmentally friendly as they can be for the longer term. And I know insurers are working very closely with organisations across the world to do that and understand the risks better. And that part of some premiums or insurance policies to say you need a certain level of technology around environmental standards for us to provide this policy. So things are happening, things are definitely shifting, but we need to keep up the pressure and recognise that climate risk is important and a key concern now for organisations.
Thanks very much. And we've seen very unfortunate decisions, like the low carbon or zero carbon homes decision and so on, where enormous amounts of effort was invested to ensure that buildings were built better, and then that was abandoned. And it does show how government regulation and government policy is hugely important in this area. So it's a combined effort, not an effort that any one actor can really dominate in. There's a question from Craig Ross. Where does the panel see gaps in resilience in the built environment, skills gaps, training and industry and knowledge? I think this is a really interesting issue because even though there are many things that we know need to be done, like dealing with the UK's legacy housing stock, even with the best will in the world, when you look at what that actually entails, it's not at all clear that we actually have the resources of manpower and all the rest of it to do it on the timescale needed. And Robert, in your role in Resilience First, would you like to comment on that sort of broad picture of where UK PLC, so to speak, or this muscular new player in the world scene, where do we need to address skills gaps and so on?
Well, thank you, Chris. And it's an interesting question. And I would start by saying that I think one of the positives out of COVID is that it's or beginning to dawn upon us that we are going to have to retrain, reskill, re-educate a lot of people who are potentially going to be unemployed as a result of the pandemic. And to transfer that across to climate change, I think there's going to be a big skills requirement once the green environment, green lobby is able to muster its forces to generate the jobs that will produce the new technologies, the new skills that the green environment will require. And people will constantly need, therefore, to change their employment opportunities and skills as they go through life, rather than in the past, we've had one job and we've stuck with it for 20 or 30 years. Now, things are changing. COVID, climate are all going to require us to think about ways we can use our skills in new environments. And I think there's a lot to be done, both from COVID and from the green environment, that will require us to look at these technologies and how we fill them.
Thanks. I just add that this plays out across the piece. I'm particularly interested and working hard on the issue of the climate science community itself, which the reward system, the esteem system and the funding system still pushes people towards discovering new facts and knowledge. And Julia and Jason and a band of others are a relatively small fraction of the community who've learned the skills to connect with society, whether it's government or general public or business. But at present, it seems to me that there is a desperate need to shift the dial, even in the climate science community, so that a greater effort is going into collaborating with the insurance industry or whoever it is to ensure that society responds in the way it needs to. So there are examples all over the piece of this need to rethink, ask the question, what are we for, and are we fulfilling societal need? Anybody else on the panel having sort of provoked the science community in that way? Jason, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so I do recognise that view, but that view already feels like it's changed quite a bit. And I look amongst my colleagues, and I think increasingly there's a desire to communicate. There's a desire to make the results more useful. And I think also in some of the new scientific journals, there's more of a focus on communication. as well. So you do get the traditional career rewards, but by bringing in the communication angle. But I think the other side of this is it's not just about communication. It's about saying, well, climate science in particular is very good at producing information on hazard. We can talk about temperature rise, we can talk about rainfall, but the biggest change I'm seeing is how we bring that together with the exposure and the vulnerability. And that requires a whole new set of disciplines, a whole new way of working to understand how those quantities come together. But you need to do that if you're going to make it relevant. But then you need to go a stage further and not just talk about defining the problem or the scale of the potential impact or risk. Then I think you have to get more into testing out interventions within our climate model and within our thinking around this. And that's happening more, but that feels like it's at an earlier stage, that part of the process.
Thanks. What I'd just add to that, and essentially you were getting to this conclusion that it's not a one-way ticket. It's not the science community throwing information over the wall and letting other people deal with it. It's actually working with people, and that requires rolling your sleeves up and operating in quite a different way, getting inside each other's heads so that you begin to understand each other and can work together in I hate this word co-production, but you know what I mean, jointly to solve problems. And so I think for the people listening in from the various parts of the insurance industry and others, knowing how to find that kind of tame climate scientists with whom they can work to establish a relationship so that they can indeed work together to solve problems is probably a barrier. I think very few people in the country, if you go out on the street, can name either a living or dead scientist and have never met one. So if you're desperate to get your business adapted, how do you go about contacting people? Julia, maybe you could, from your viewpoint on the adaptation subcommittee, point people in that direction.
Well, of course, the thing that we're working on the adaptation committee at the moment very strongly is the evidence base for the third climate change risk assessment. Every 5 years, the UK government has to present to Parliament a climate change risk assessment. What are the main risks to the UK from the changing climate over the next 5 years? The last one was in 2017, so the next one is due in 2022. And behind that is a big process of doing exactly what Jason was talking about, of taking the science about the changing climate and turning that into what is the risk to nature, what is the risk to business, what is the risk to people. And the evidence base for that we pull together and present to the government. And that's, although we pull it together on the adaptation committee, it involves some 200 scientists and engineers and others in producing this report. So we will be publishing that in around the middle of next year. CCRA2 evidence report is on the Climate Change Committee's website from 2016, but we will be publishing this new one, the evidence base, next year. And of course, we're very, very engaged with the Met Office in doing that, and indeed using as far as possible, using the Met Office's latest climate change predictions, the CP18 climate predictions.
Thanks very much. And just the only other thing I would add, really answering my own question, is that there are universities all over the country. Many of them have climate change experts within them. And so if there are business people out there who want to try and find an expert, starting with your local university would probably be a good first step. And
of course, there are many consultancies and others who can help you in that area as well. There's quite a wide range of support.
Excellent. Good.
And you can come to the Met Office too.
Good.
Okay. I'll build on the point if that's okay. Very quick. We, interestingly, especially over the last year, at control risks, we've been seeing much more focus on the impact of climate on organisations, and particularly we've been working recently with events organisations, so holding large events globally, who are becoming very interested in the impacts of climate in the short and longer term on those events. And we have found a friendly climate scientist who we're working with, and we're looking to build that relationship out. I'm sure my colleagues on the call might even know who that is, but I won't name them. But essentially, it does work really well when you take that business knowledge, you combine it with the scientific knowledge, you can come up with solutions. And I see that as a very exciting prospect to take forward.
Yeah, it is, and it's very interesting that what I find, or what we find, is that with early career scientists, with younger scientists, there's a huge enthusiasm for this. Younger scientists don't necessarily have the same view of the careers as we did, 30, 40 years ago. Don't even know if they're going to be in academia in 5 years' time. So they get a great kick out of knowing that they've not only discovered something new, but that it has practical value that they can see being exploited. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for that. I just say to those listening that we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. So there's still a chance for people to put in questions on the chat box. But for the moment, I'm going to pick one which is very relevant. What does the response to COVID-19 tell us about how we could improve our responses to climate change? And that couples with another question in the chat box about, are the panelists optimistic of a green and resilient recovery? So how is COVID helping us see our way into the future, both in terms of how nations did and didn't handle it well, and how we've got an opportunity now to build back better in a very general way? Who'd like to pick that up? I'll throw it open and let one of the panelists pop in. Julia.
Well, I'll start very quickly. I mean, I think the lesson from COVID is, here's something that was predicted by good science, and we didn't respond to or prepare from. We've heard all of Jason's good science, or not all of it, of course, but some of Jason's good science telling us what's going to happen. We've got really high quality science saying this is what's going to happen. We need to learn that lesson of responding to it, and taking the action that's needed. But I would also say, in terms of optimism, the Committee on Climate Change, the Adaptation and Mitigation Committees, wrote to the Prime Minister to say what we thought a green recovery for both mitigation and adaptation would be. We've had an extremely positive letter back from Boris Johnson, which is on the Committee on Climate Change website. If the government delivers those words, then that will be good. But of course, we need to see that action. And of course, I fear there is distraction with both Brexit and COVID at the moment, which means we're not yet seeing action fast enough. Hopefully, in a way, the looming COP will get them more focused soon, and we will start to see much more action.
Yeah, the Conference of the Parties next year, indeed. Philip, do you want to add something in on this issue?
So yes, just building on Julia's points, really. So I agree. Fundamentally, organisations are now looking at emerging strategic risks much more closely than they perhaps did in the past. And that's a sweeping generalisation, but I know some have done it well and others don't. But I think the fact that this has been, the pandemic has been very much what I call a rising tide crisis. So it's kind of, like boiling the frog. It's taken us not by surprise. We knew about it, but I think the surprise, the way it's risen and kept going, has kept us surprised all the way along. And climate change is very similar to that. So I think what it's going to do and it is doing now, corporates are changing their approach to their resilience. They're also starting to change their approach from what we're talking to and seeing in the industry, their approach to longer term emerging risks and trends such as climate change. So I think that more than any other time than before, this particular point is a great opportunity for us to come out this greener and more resilient than we have, and happy to face the future like that.
Okay, Jason, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, just briefly. So I think it's also told us something directly relevant to resilience. It's told us how systems in the UK and globally really are interconnected. Yeah. And how when you make a massive impact on one part of that system, it ripples through. So it's told us about that, but it's also told us about behavioural change. It's told us how people respond to messaging. And it's also shown how some large-scale changes, like we're doing today, working from home, practically feel and how they can work. And I think those lessons are incredibly valuable and can be transferred to other issues like climate resilience.
Yeah, I think that last point is really important. What would have seemed utterly inconceivable 8 months ago just happened because it had to, force majeure. So what it does show is that society can flex much more quickly than perhaps any of us had felt it could prior to the COVID thing. So look, we're beginning to drain down on time now. Let's just look at what is the biggest challenge that panelists would like to see to help accelerate the green agenda. I think we've been sort of touching on that. From Bina Chester, actually following up this COVID thing, one of the things that we didn't mention in that little discussion is, of course, that there's going to be a huge financial impact as a result of COVID. Any comments from the panelists on how that might play out, either positively or negatively? It's certainly going to make people focus their minds. Philip, you raised your hand, and Julia, I'll come to you after Philip.
Thank you. Coming back to where I started my story back in 2007, when we were doing lots of sustainability work in the oil and gas sector. Shortly after that, we had the global financial crash, and I can say that sustainability consulting wasn't the first thing on people's mind. Survival. So I think the concern for me this time round is exactly that. If we go into a period of financial distress, which is over a couple of years, how focused organisations are going to be on that, on the green agenda, on climate change. And I think the key to that is, as I said earlier on in my presentation, is making sure that those behaviours are embedded in organisations, through insurers, through regulators, through having really strong metrics in your enterprise risk-wide systems, and making sure that as long as those are in there and organisations are abiding by that set of criteria and boundaries, we can no longer step back from that brink. We need to keep going forward and building on the great work that's been done today. So I think that's the key challenge, and I just hope it doesn't turn out to be a 2007-8 again, where we can step back off our sustainability and climate change activity.
Thank you. Julia, one last very quick comment on that.
Yeah, mine would be that the sorts of things we can do to make ourselves more resilient. So increased investment, for example, in natural and also concrete flood defences and kind of things Emma were doing, the things to convert our buildings. These are things that will create jobs here in the UK that will therefore have people earning money and paying tax. The government can borrow money really cheaply at the moment. So these are the sort of win-win-win investments that can make us greener and more resilient, can give people who need them jobs, and can help to get our economy back on track.
Thanks very much. Well, look, thank you for that. I'm sensitive to the fact that I've allowed the Q&A to slightly run over. So I just finished by saying that the key points that popped out of that for me are that COVID shows us what happens if you don't prepare adequately. All of the evidence is that this issue has to be taken very seriously. We should, 2 degrees is almost certain to become the new normal, and you should be thinking ahead to what 4 degrees might mean. It's a question of finding agency, finding a process by which you can adapt and abate. And the last comment I would make is that there are communities of practice. So what works in one area for a particular community can be translated elsewhere, and that allows an exponential growth of success once a new way forward, a successful way forward, has been found in a local instant. So I'm going to finish there and say thank you very much to the panelists. I think it's been an excellent discussion, and I'll hand back to Robert.
Thank you very much. You're right, this has been a fascinating hour. We've covered a lot of ground. On behalf of Resilience First, it just leaves me to really thank all the speakers and particularly the chair for the contributions today. We will be circulating a short summary of the conversations in due course and share as well Jason's slides once the speakers have approved that. So it just leaves me to say that please join us again for our next webinar, which is on the 7th of October on agility and resilience.
Excellent.
So thank you very much for participating. Stay safe and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.